Good day, students, and welcome back to another math video. I hope you are excited because this is the video where you learn how to solve equations. Now, some of you may see an equation like this one up at the top and already kind of internally be able to figure out what the value of x is supposed to be. However, today we're going to talk about the step-by-step process that is a surefire way to be able to solve any equation that you encounter, and it will be a really good preparation for you as we begin to solve all these different levels of equations. We have one-step equations, two-step equations, multi-step equations. We have some what I like to call weird equations that we're going to get into. And before you maybe internally freak out about, what is this? Why are there letters in my math? Like, this looks insane. I want you to think about equations as little puzzles, okay? Just like how a regular math problem could kind of be considered a puzzle where you're trying to find an unknown. In equations, you truly have an unknown. That's all the letter represents. So you're trying to kind of work backwards in order to figure out what is the unknown. And equations are used to represent a lot of different things in the real world. A letter in math is what's known as a variable, which we've talked about before in a previous video. And there are a lot of unknowns and a lot of areas in the real world where something is not known. And depending on what the actual situation is, people who work certain jobs can write equations and solve in order to figure out what the unknown should be. And there are many different instances, especially in engineering, in medicine, in even in like service industries, like restaurants and things like that. So if you want to dive a little bit more into it, I will try to post a link in the description bar of how equations are used in many different areas of life. But for the time being, let's talk about how we solve equations. Okay. So the first thing is, let's review the different parts of an equation, because that's going to come into play when we talk about the steps to solve. So before I do that, if you want to take a moment to pause and copy down what you see here, this is kind of how your page needs to be set up. Okay. So let's go over the different parts of an equation. So we obviously have our letter, which is our variable. This is the unknown. This is what we are solving for in an equation. We also have, or we typically have, something that the equation is equivalent to, and we would call this the solution. So this is what everything on the algebraic side of the equation is going to be equal to. And this is kind of like our helpful hint in order to try to figure out what our variable is. We utilize the solution in order to work backwards to figure out what our variable represents. We also typically have some sort of constant, which is a number on its own. Or I like to think about this, if we kind of personify the variable, if we think of x as like a person, I like to kind of think about the constant as the x's buddy. And then we also have the coefficient, which is always the number that's being multiplied by the variable. So coefficient. It's kind of a hard word to spell. This I like to call the BFF of x, because they're literally like attached at the hip. They're right next to each other. They hang out with each other all the time. Okay. And the buddy, it's on the same side of the equation. Like, it hangs around the variable, but it's not attached at the hip. It's not as close. Okay. And I'm going to use the analogy of using buddy and BFF when we talk about the steps to solve. Okay. But the goal when we are solving an equation is to isolate the variable. We are trying to figure out, what does x equal? So in order to do this, we are going to utilize all these different parts and utilize those properties of equality that we learned about in the last video in order to get the variable alone on one side of the equation. Essentially, we're going to take x, if we think about x as a person, and we're going to take away all its friends. We're going to take away its constant, and we're going to take away its BFF. And before you're like, Miss Walker, that's so rude. Like, what did x ever do to you? I don't know. Pick something that you think x has done that's really mean, and now you want to get revenge and you want to take away all its friends. How about that? Or just go along with it. It's all good. Okay. Again, all hypothetical, not real life scenarios. Okay. So now that we know we're going to isolate the variable, let's talk about the 3 steps to solve. Okay. So the first thing when we need to solve an equation, the first very important step that makes our life a whole lot easier is combine any like terms. Combine your like terms. So if you have like 2x and 4x and 6x, combine all those like terms. However, you need to combine them, adding, subtracting, whatever the signs are telling you to do. Combine your like terms, because then it means less steps to solve in the future. Then the second thing you're going to do is you're going to get rid of the constants and the buddy, or you're going to get rid of the constants and by using the pose. Okay. So the second step is get rid of constant or the buddy using the pose. Okay. So for instance, if the constant is being added, we're going to use the inverse operation, the subtraction property of equality, ESPO, to solve. Okay. And the reason why we get rid of the constant first is because it is easier to get rid of than the coefficient. Think about it in terms of the buddy and BFF. If you were trying to get revenge on this variable who has wronged you in some sort of way, if you were trying to maybe convince their friends that like they're not a good person, you probably would go to a buddy first, someone who's not as close to them, and kind of let them in on, what you know about them before you go to the BFF, right? Because the BFF is going to be a lot harder to convince. So that's why we get rid of our constants first. Once we get rid of our constants, then we're going to go take on the hard task. And it's not really that hard mathematically, but you know what I mean. We're going to get rid of the coefficient or the BFF, also using pose. So depending on how the coefficient is written, we might use dpo, we might use mpo, and so forth. But we're going to get rid of the coefficient using the pose. And then once we've gotten rid of all of the buddies and the BFF, then we will be left with this X who has wronged us in some sort of way, all alone on its own side of the equation without any of its friends anymore. And we'll know what it's equivalent to in this mathematical equation. Okay. So we're actually going to take a moment to look at the problem up above, and we're going to model these 3 steps. And then the rest of the videos following this, I'm going to be using this 3-step model, and you'll see how it works for equations that maybe only involve 1 step, 2-step, multi-step. Maybe there's something where we have to use the distributive property. There's all these different kinds of equations that are involved. Okay. So underneath where you have your steps to solve, let's actually write the equation. So we have 3x plus 15 equals 60. This is actually an example of a 2-step equation because this is going to take me 2 steps or 2 properties of equality in order to solve. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is combine any like terms. It doesn't look like I have any like terms because I have a constant, a solution, a coefficient. There are no other things that I could combine. So that step is already complete. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the constant by using the pose. So in this problem, the constant is being added. So I'm going to use the inverse operation of subtracting in order to get rid of this constant of 15. So I have to subtract 15 on this side of the equation in order to get rid of it. So by using the subtraction property of equality, which I would also like for you to label over here, okay, I am going to subtract 15 from the other side. So if I simplify this equation now, 3x is just going to stay the same. 15 minus 15 is just like we're adding 0. And then 60 minus 15 is going to be equivalent to 45. So if I rewrite this without the plus 0, because anything plus 0 is just going to be itself, right? We have 3x is equal to 45. So this is now what our equation is. Now, since we've gotten rid of the buddy, we're going to go take on the last task and the hardest task of getting rid of the coefficient or the BFF. So in order to get rid of the BFF, I need to look at what kind of math is being done. There's multiplication happening between 3 and x. And before you start saying, oh, we'll use the MPO property. No, remember, we always want to use the inverse operation. So the opposite of multiplying is actually going to be to use the depot property. We are going to divide both sides by 3 in order to figure out what x is equal to. Because if we think about this mathematically, this is saying 3 times something makes 45. So if we don't know what that is off the top of our head, we can divide 45 by 3 in order to figure out what that is. So anytime we divide something by itself, okay, that is going to be equivalent to 1 times x, okay? And 1 times x is just equivalent to x on its own. So x is going to be equal to whatever 45 divided by 3 is, which is 15. So I have officially solved this equation. I have figured out what the value of the variable is. And if I want to go check my answer, I can just go plug it back in to check. So I'm going to write a note. plug back in to check. So what I mean by plug back in is if I go plug 15 back into the original equation, and if I do 3 times 15 plus 15, I should get 60. If I don't, then that means I did something wrong. Because sometimes what will happen is you'll have integers involved. Like this could have been a -3, or this could have been a -60. And if you kind of mess up the integers, you might have to go back and evaluate if you did your multiplication, addition, subtraction, all that kinds of stuff wrong. So I'm going to leave a note to follow the integer rules. Follow integer rules. So if we're, multiplying two negatives, dividing by two negatives, all that kinds of stuff, those rules still apply. So this is an example of how we use the 3-step process of solving equations. In the next couple videos, we'll dive into more examples like this, and you can see the process. And again, before you stress out that this is something that is, it is something that is new and different probably for a lot of you. But remember, these are kind of like solving puzzles. You're trying to figure out what this piece is, and we're breaking down the problem and working to solve it, just like how we would solve, any kind of random logic puzzle or any other kind of thing that would require an unknown. I hope you enjoyed this video. There are actually no practice questions in this video. Spirit fingers, because this was mainly just a setup. In the next couple of videos, you will have some practice questions to practice solving equations. So I hope y'all have a good day, and I will see you very soon. Bye.